Welcome to Things You Don't Know. This is a kind of really different one. The Green Children of Woolpit. It relates to some strange tales. I want to welcome you back to Things You Don't Know, where we investigate history's strangest tales. Today, we journey to the 12th century countryside to unravel the mystery of the Green Children of Woolpit. This story has it all: medieval chronicles, folklore, possible aliens, hidden history, and a lingering question: who were the Green Children? And where did they come from?
I've been really excited about this one too. Children with green skin appearing out of nowhere in a medieval village. It sounds like folklore and fantasy, but we actually have written accounts from the time. It's equally eerie and fascinating.
That's right. This isn't just some village rumor that faded away. It was recorded by two well-respected medieval chroniclers, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, which gives the tale a bit more weight. Yet even they seem perplexed. It's a very mysterious case that blurs the line between history and legend, and we will explore both the documented facts and the many interpretations that have emerged over the centuries.
So get comfortable. We're delving into a nearly 900-year-old mystery that will take us from the fields of medieval Suffolk to the realms of folklore and possibly other worlds. Let's start at the beginning. What exactly happened in Woolpit all those centuries ago? Well, I know, Dr. Deneen, you've looked at the original medieval accounts, being the astounding historian you are. Paint the scene for us. What do these chronicles actually say about the Green Children?
I'll do my best, Dr. Weaver. The story takes place, as we said, in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk in East Anglia, probably sometime in the mid to late 12th century. William of Newburgh, writing in the 1180s or 1190s, and Ralph of Coggeshall, writing a few decades later, both report essentially the same astonishing event. According to William's History Rerum Anglorum, History of Beloved England, during the reign of King Stephen between 1135 and 1154, the villagers of Woolpit discovered two young children, a brother and a sister, near the edge of a field at harvest time, beside one of the wolf pits that gave Woolpit its name. And here's the kicker: their skin was green, literally green hued, and their clothes were made of some unfamiliar material in both a color and a style that the locals didn't recognize.
It is worth noting that the term wolf pit also refers to a military application known as a trou de loup, which is French for wolf hole. These were also pits, but often concealed and designed as defensive obstacles with sharpened stakes at the bottom intended to injure or trap enemy soldiers. But let's get back to the topic here, Chandler.
Yeah, let's do that. Green skin, strange clothes, and gibberish. It must have been a real shocking sight for medieval farmers.
Absolutely. The chroniclers say that the children spoke in an unknown language, so no one could understand them. They were very disoriented. At first, the villagers brought the children into the village and, not knowing what else to do, took them to a home of a local lord, Richard de Caline. So Richard and his household tried to care for them. The accounts mentioned that the children refused to eat any of the food offered to them for several days, which really must have perplexed their hosts.
They wouldn't eat anything? So, how did they survive then?
They almost didn't. The children were going weak from hunger until someone brought in some freshly harvested broad beans, fava beans. Upon seeing the raw beans, the green children became very excited. In fact, Williams says they opened the beanstalks looking for the beans inside, and when they didn't find the beans in their hollow stems, they broke down crying. The onlookers then showed them how to open the bean pods, revealing the beans. Immediately, the children ate the raw beans eagerly. For a while, that was all they would eat, raw beans, for many months. It sustained them until they gradually started expanding their diet and eating other food. As they adapted to eating normal food, something remarkable happened. The green hued skin faded away and their skin returned to a normal color.
Dr. Deneen, I must say, that little tidbit in there about their skin turning normal after a change in diet is quite interesting. It sounds to me almost like a nutritional issue, which we'll get to later. But let's continue. What became of the children?
Sadly, not both children survived. Both chroniclers agree the boy was younger and in a weaker condition. After finally being baptized, the boy grew sick and died shortly thereafter. The girl, however, survived, grew healthier, and eventually learned to speak English. Now, here, this is where the story gets even more intriguing. Once she could finally communicate, she told her caretakers where she and her brother had come from.
And this is where it shifts from curious anecdote to full on legend. According to William of Newburgh's account, once the girl spoke English, she said they came from a place she called St. Martin's Land. She described it as a country of perpetual twilight. In her words, the sun does not rise upon our countrymen. Our land is little cheered by its beams. We are contented with that twilight which among you precedes the sunrise or follows the sunset. And she said that a certain luminous country is seen not far from ours and divided from it by a very considerable river. In other words, their homeland was a dim place with no direct sunlight, twilight all the time, and they could see a bright land across a wide river.
That sounds to me like something straight out of a fairy tale, Dr. Weaver. A land of perpetual twilight? A bright country separated by a river? You could almost say it's poetic, almost even otherworldly.
It truly is, and Ralph of Cockshaw's version adds an even more fantastical detail. He notes that in St. Martin's Land, everything was green. Not just the people's skin, but the entire landscape had a green hue. Ralph's chronicle also gives a slightly different twist on how the children arrived in Woolpit. William of Newburgh admitted he wasn't sure how they got here. The girl herself supposedly said they didn't know the exact way they arrived, just at one moment they were herding their father's cattle, then heard a loud noise like church bells, and suddenly they were by the wolf pit where they were found. William notes that the girl compared the loud sound to the bells of Bury St. Edmund's Abbey, which they could later hear ringing from Woolpit.
Now, Ralph of Cogshaw's account is a bit more specific on this point. He wrote that the children were actually following their family's cattle when they wandered into a cave or cavern, got lost in the darkness, and when they eventually emerged, they found themselves in our world, emerging out of the wolf pits near Woolpit, guided by the sound of bells. In other words, Ralph depicts them literally traveling through an underground passage between worlds. The detail about following cattle into a cave is unique to Ralph's telling, but both versions mention the sound of bells guiding the children to the surface.
It almost sounds like a folktale motif. Children following cattle into a cave and then coming out in another land, guided by church bells. We'll definitely need to talk about the folklore parallels later, I think.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. Before that, what else do the chronicles say about the girl's fate? She survived. Did she integrate into normal society?
Yes, she did, although not without some colorful commentary. Ralph of Coxall rather bluntly notes that the girl became a servant in Sir Richard Calane's household and that she was considered very wanton and impudent as she grew older, implying she was a bit unruly or of loose behavior in her teenage years. William of Newburgh's account is kinder. He says she eventually married a man from the town of King's Lynn, which is about 40 miles from Woolpit, and was still living there around the time William was writing. In fact, there's an even later researcher who tried to pin down her identity based on Richard de Calane's family records. An astronomer and author, Duncan Lunan, suggested the Green Girl might have been given the name Agnes and married a royal official named Richard Barre. That part is speculative, but it's fascinating that someone tried to trace her life.
So, according to William, the girl lived on and assimilated into English society, marrying and presumably leaving her strange origins behind. William even prefaces the story by saying he was reluctant to believe it at first, but so many reputable witnesses swore it was true that he felt compelled to believe and record it, despite how unbelievable it sounded.
Yes, you can certainly sense William's scholarly skepticism. He writes that he feared the story was ridiculous and unsupported by reason, but he was, quote, overwhelmed by the weight of so many competent witnesses that he had to accept it. This little comment by William of Newburgh lets us know that even in the 12th century, this story was considered highly unusual. William included it in his history with a sort of disclaimer that it was an unheard of prodigy that he himself struggled to rationalize.
Well, what about our old buddy Ralph? Did he ever indicate how he heard the stories?
Ralph of Coggeshall actually gives us a clue. He says he obtained the story directly from Sir Richard de Calais the very night who took the children in and from others in his household. Since Ralph was writing in the 1220s, decades after the incident, he presumably spoke to people who had known the Green Girl, perhaps even the girl herself if she was still alive then. Ralph was an abbot in Essex, not far from Woolpit, so he had access to local testimony. William, on the other hand, was up in Yorkshire and heard the tale secondhand from travelers without naming specific sources. Interestingly, the two writers didn't appear to be aware of each other's versions, yet the core details align, which suggests the story had spread widely.
So, summarizing the core stories, the two green skinned children appear in Woolpit. They won't eat normal food. They survive on raw beans. The boy dies. The girl lives. She says they come from a twilight land called St. Martin's Land, where everything is green and there's no direct sun. They somehow got here via a cave or by a miraculous transport guided by sound. She stays and assimilates into English life. It's an incredible story to have in monastic chronicles. What do you think, Chandler?
I think it's an incredible story too. And now that's going to lead us to ask the question, could there be some truth to this? Or is this just a medieval folk tale written down? What was happening in 12th century Suffolk that might shed light on a more down to earth explanation?
Maybe we can give this a little bit of historical context in 12th century Suffolk. To make sense of this, let's step back and set the scene. Now, Dr. Deneen, take us to 12th century Suffolk. What was the environment like around Woolpit at that time? And could it give rise to a real scenario behind the legend?
Well, Dr. Weaver, Woolpit in the 1100s was a typical rural English village, but not an isolated one. It lay in eastern England, County Suffolk, and actually near a major abbey, Bury St. Edmunds. It was a market town, so villagers would have been used to travelers and traders. There's one key piece of context. There was a very significant migration of Flemish people from what would now be Belgium to that part of England in the mid 12th century. Flemish weavers and merchants had been encouraged to settle in England. Many came to East Anglia. In fact, one nearby village was literally named Forham St. Martin, just north of Bury St. Edmunds, which had a Flemish community. Now, politically, the mid 12th century was tumultuous. You had the quote anarchy period between 1135 and 1153. That was a civil war between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda for the English throne. Later on, in 1173, during the early reign of Matilda's son, King Henry II, there was another flare up of civil conflict. Henry's own sons rebelled against him. That's called the Revolt of 1173-74. Now, why does this matter? Flemish mercenaries were involved in these conflicts. For example, in 1173, a battle was fought at Forham St. Martin, very close by, between Henry II's forces and the rebel forces that included a large contingent of Flemish fighters. Henry's forces won, and the Flemish mercenaries were slaughtered in large numbers. After Henry II secured power, he reportedly cracked down on Flemish immigrants. Some were expelled, and certainly the atmosphere would be hostile toward any remaining Flemish in the area. So imagine you have a community of foreign language speakers. The Flemish spoke a language that was a dialect of Middle Dutch, living in Suffolk. Then suddenly war and violence erupts around them. It is certainly conceivable that some children from these Flemish families could have been orphaned or lost during the chaos.
So you're suggesting that the green children might have actually been real children from a Flemish immigrant family, lost kids who wandered into an English village?
That's one leading theory among historians. In 1998, researcher Paul Harris published an analysis that argued the green children of Woolpit was a garbled real event. He proposes that the children were Flemish kids from the village of Forham St. Martin. Notice the name St. Martin's Land, possibly not a magical underworld, but a literal village named after St. Martin. According to Harris, their parents could have been Flemish settlers or cloth workers who were caught up in the violence, perhaps even killed, either during the anarchy or in that battle of Fornham in 1173. The children survived, fled, and wandered through the woods. Woolpit is about 10 miles, 16 kilometers from Forham St. Martin, so the two children could conceivably wander that far if they were lost. When they stumbled into Woolpit, they spoke only Flemish, which the villagers didn't understand, and they wore unfamiliar Flemish clothing. To the Woolpit locals who might not have personally encountered Flemish speakers, the children's speech was completely unrecognizable and their attire strange.
Yeah, that would explain the unknown language and strange clothing, right? Maybe not. Flemish would have sounded alien to English ears then, and their clothing might have been of a Flemish style. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but what about their green skin? And what about the green landscape? That's a crucial part of the story here.
It is. Harris addressed that too. He suggested the children's green tinged skin could be explained by hyperchromic anemia, historically known as cholerasis or green sickness, which is caused by a severe dietary deficiency. If these children were lost in the woods for a long time, malnourished, and possibly hiding out of fear for their lives, remember after the battle, any Flemish survivors might have been in danger from vengeful locals or soldiers. They could have developed a sickly greenish pallor. Indeed, medieval people named choleratic anemia green sickness because in some cases the skin appeared pale with a greenish tinge. Once the children were fed a normal diet at Sir Richard's house, their health improved and the green color faded, which is exactly what the chronicles describe. So it fits pretty well. Malnourished kids turn greenish, get better with food, and lose the green hue.
That actually sounds surprisingly plausible. Green skin from malnutrition is something that we can actually make sense of in medical terms, and it neatly matches the story. They wouldn't eat at first. Maybe they were just extremely disoriented or even traumatized. Then they get nutrition and recover.
Now, the Flemish orphan theory covers a lot: language, clothes, green skin. Are historians convinced by this?
Many do find it compelling, but it's not without issues. John Clark, a researcher and creator emeritus at the Museum of London, has studied this mystery and he pointed out some problems with the Flemish theory. For one, Woolpit's people were fairly accustomed to foreigners due to trade. Bury St. Edmunds, as we said, nearby had a bustling market, and Flemish weavers were not unheard of in eastern England. It's argued that the villagers, or certainly Sir Richard de Culzean, a knight, a presumably educated and well-traveled man, should have recognized the language as Flemish, or at least recognized the kids as human foreigners rather than supernatural oddities. I mean, would no one among them really identify the language? Harris suggested that Sir Richard did realize maybe that they were Flemish, but kept it quiet to protect the children given the anti-Flemish sentiment at the time. We have to imagine if these were refugee kids from a persecuted group, a kindly local lord might choose to hide their identity for their safety. That's conjecture, but it's one way to reconcile it.
Well, what about the detail with the beans? If they were Flemish children on the run, presumably they might have been eating whatever they could find in the woods. Maybe they were even eating raw beans or plants. But the story says that they didn't know how to get the beans out of the stalk until shown.
That's another sticking point. If they'd survived by foraging, you'd think they'd know how beans grow in pots. Their initial confusion with the beanstalks, looking for beans inside the stalk, suggests they hadn't been eating those in the wild. However, to play devil's advocate, maybe in their weak and starving state, they just weren't thinking straight. Or these particular kids were young enough not to know much about agriculture. The boy was the younger one. He was possibly quite small, and even the girl might have been only, say, 8 or 10 years old.
There's also the timing. One chronicle links it to King Stephen's reign, around 1135 to 1154. Another seems to imply later. The Battle of Fornham, St. Martin, was 1173. If the Green Children story happened during King Stephen's time, that's earlier, possibly around 1140s or 1150s. However, Ralph of Coggeshall wrote in the 1220s and implies he knew people who knew the girl. If she was still alive in his time, the event could have been closer to the 1150s or 1160s, which could align them with being children of Flemish immigrants during the anarchy period. Alternatively, William's source might have misremembered the king's name. Look, we can't be sure, but the presence of Flemish settlers was a reality throughout that mid-12th century, due to both the anarchy and later events. So that part of the theory remains plausible.
Well, it sounds like, at the very least, the Flemish orphan hypothesis places the tale in real historical context. The real idea that the Green children were actually children that were displaced by war and ethnic conflict in medieval England, well, it transforms the story from a fairy tale into a human refugee story, which is quite fascinating.
Well, the whole thing is kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
It would make the Green Children one of the more poignant footnotes of medieval history, if true. But before we conclude that it was just lost kids with anemia, We should note that not everyone is on board with that explanation, as Dr. Deneen mentioned. John Clark wasn't convinced by the anemia angle either, noting that malnutrition was common then. Yet green tinted skin was clearly unusual enough to be noted. If chlorosis made everyone a bit greenish, the villagers might not have been so astonished. So maybe the children's coloration was truly striking, which might imply something far more rare.
Exactly. And some have proposed other medical explanations. One suggestion is arsenic poisoning, although that's more tied to a different local legend, often called the Babes in the Wood tale, where two children are poisoned with arsenic by an uncle, giving their skin a greenish hue. In that version, which is likely a later folk merging with the Woolpit story, the children escape the murder attempt and wander, eventually falling into the Woolpits. It's not a primary explanation historians favor, but it shows how people have tried to rationalize the green skin. Another medical idea that I've seen floated, favism, that's a hereditary bean allergy. If ironically these kids have a condition that made fava beans, their initial food, actually toxic to them, that could cause a severe illness. It can cause hemolytic anemia and a jaundiced yellow-green complexion. In fact, broad beans, fava beans, trigger this condition. It's speculative, but some have pointed out the boy's death could lie with favism after he ate all those beans. So the chronicles don't link his death explicitly to the beans. That's modern retrofitting.
These are some very intriguing scientific explanations, but I can't help noticing that they take all the wonder out of the story. If they were just lost foreign kids with anemia, then it's more tragic than magical. Yet, the story that's told has this enduring mystical vibe, and maybe that's a good segue beyond historical hypotheses. What about the more fantastical interpretations? Because clearly not everyone believes that the green children were just ordinary humans.
Oh, you're right. You're definitely right. Let's delve into the speculative side. Over the years, people have proposed all kinds of otherworldly explanations for the green children. Chandler, I sense that you're itching to talk about the aliens, so go ahead.
You got me, Dr. Weaver. Guilty as charged. And it's true. If you browse paranormal forums or some books, the Woolpit children often come up as a curious case. Some have even wondered if they were extraterrestrials, making this perhaps an early alien encounter story. Green skin, speaking in unknown languages, suddenly appearing, later returning. The boy's death, perhaps? You can see how UFO enthusiasts might latch onto this. In fact, as early as the 17th century, writers speculated about an out of this world origin. Robert Burton in 1621 suggested that the green children fell from heaven. And a bit later, a bishop named Francis Godwin wrote a sort of proto science fiction tale, The Man in the Moon, 1638, which happens to include green moon inhabitants that were inspired by the Woolpit story. Godwin basically took the idea that the children might have come from another world in his fictional account from the moon, and he ran with it.
Indeed. So the alien hypothesis, in a sense, has been around for centuries, although it was packaged in the language of the time, heavenly or lunar beings. In modern times, the story occasionally appears in a UFO or ancient alien discussions as a possibly garbled alien contact. Of course, there's zero hard evidence for that. It's more that the story's elements kind of sound like a sci fi scenario, when you remove the medieval worldview. Two beings from a twilight world accidentally transported here. If someone wanted, they could imagine a portal from another planet or another dimension.
Bum, 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 bum. Another angle is the folklore and fairy angle, which in some ways is the more traditional interpretation. After all, this story was included in a book of fairy lore in the 19th century. Let's talk about that. Do the green children fit into fairy mythology or folk tale motifs?
They do. They do, at least superficially. In folklore, there are many tales of human encounters with the otherworld, realms of fairies or spirits, often underground or in some distant land. One common motif is people entering the strange lands through caves. In fact, the medieval writer Gerald of Wales tells the story of a boy who meets tiny people, possibly fairy folk, and follows them into an underground realm filled with beautiful fields and a perpetual twilight. A land not lit by the full light of the sun, he says. This is strikingly similar to the Green Children's claim of a twilight world. So the concept of a subterranean or parallel world was certainly in the air, so to speak, in medieval folklore.
The fact that Ralph's version explicitly has the children coming through a cave from an underground land really aligns with that fairy world motif. It reads like a classic world fairy tale. Children stumble into a fairyland, which is St. Martin's Land, and accidentally wander out among the human race.
Yes. However, interestingly, actual folklore tales and collections don't have many stories exactly like this. Folklorists have searched for similar tales and found that green-skinned fairy children aren't a widespread motif. The predominant folklorist E. W. Ballman cataloged folktale myths and noted that the Woolpit story is essentially unique in its specific details. He labeled it Motif F103.1. Inhabitants of a lower world visit mortals and continue to live with them. And that's the only example of that motif that he found. So while caves to other worlds are common, actual green children coming to live and stay with humans is rare in folklore records.
What elements make people think fairy when they hear this story? For one, green is often associated with fairies in folklore. Also, there is a trope that beings from fairyland have trouble eating human food. Chandler, you mentioned something about that earlier.
Yes, you're right, I did, Dr. Weaver. In many fairy tales or myths, if someone from the fairy realm or the supernatural realm eats food from our world, or vice versa, it can trap them or harm them. In the Odsalon transcript of a talk on this, the speaker noted that these children refusing food and finally eating might echo the idea that other worldly beings fear human food. There are even stories about mermaids or fairy folk who avoid consuming human food because it binds them to our world. In the Woolpit case, the children initially reject all food, which some stories interpret that as them being wary of earthly food. When they finally eat the beans, they become fully a part of our world, and the boy being weaker does not survive the transition. There's a notion that he could not adapt, as if the fairy essence in him failed. It's a very fairy tale interpretation. The girl transitions to human life, losing her green color, growing up here, whereas the boy couldn't, and so he dies. And so writers even whimsically called them things like naughty moon children or visitors from the antipodes, fanciful labels implying that they were not human in origin.
This sounds like how Victorian or early 20th century folks might have framed it, more as a fairy tale than an historical event. It is worth noting that the St. Martin connection also caught some folklorists' attention. St. Martin is not typically a figure in fairy tale lore, but one scholar, Martin Walsh, theorized that the name St. Martin's Land might hint at an atavistic ritual or myth. He speculated that the story preserves traces of some ancient English folklore tied to Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin in November. Perhaps an old ritual about life and death, with the green children symbolizing a cycle. Green could mean youth or even death, as in the Polar, and then returning to life when they lose the green. However, others have strongly criticized that idea. There's no clear evidence linking St. Martin to any underworld myth in England. It might just be overthinking it.
Dr. Weaver, here's another fascinating symbolic angle. Some have pointed out the children's story could represent death and rebirth. The folklorist Catherine Biggs noted that in some cultures beans are associated with the dead. She claims beans were initially considered food of the dead. In the Woolpit tale, the children survive on the beans initially, as if they themselves were like souls from the land of the dead needing that food. When they start eating normal food, bread, and other things, they join the living. It reminds me of the Persephone and Hades myth from Greek mythology. John Clarke was very skeptical that medieval English tradition truly viewed beans as food of the dead in any significant way, but he did concede that across many cultures, beans have symbolic ties to death. Also, fertility, think of the ancient Roman rituals of the followers of the Pythagorean religion avoiding beans and onions. That's a funny story. They thought every time you pass gas, you lose part of your soul. So if one wanted to read deeply, the children's green color and bean diet could symbolically cast them as coming from a kind of liminal state between life and death, and their gradual humanization, losing their green color, eating real food, being baptized, is like a rebirth into our world.
Wow, Dr. Deneen, that's a layer I hadn't even considered yet. It gives the story almost this mythic, allegorical quality. Life, death, rebirth, crossing rivers. I tell you, it's like the story operates on two levels, the literal narrative and a symbolic one. I like that.
Yeah, it's true. And speaking of rivers, remember the girl mentioned a luminous country separated from her land by a large river. In many mythologies, crossing a river is symbolic of crossing from the land of the living to the land of the dead, like the river Styx. So if we keep that symbolic lens, St. Martin's Land could be a purgatorial world. Twilight equals neither fully alive nor dead. And the green children somehow crossed over that boundary. Again, this is speculative interpretation, but it shows how richly this tale can be viewed.
Dr. Weaver, it's also worth noting that medieval writers themselves sometimes saw what they call marvels as having deeper meanings. William of Newburgh, for example, after recounting this story, basically throws up his hands and says, "Let each reader say what they will. I'm just recording this prodigy." But he also categorized it among wonders that might have what he called latent meaning. Some medieval chroniclers included strange events as moral or spiritual allegories inserted into their histories. There's an academic argument that William and Ralph didn't just record this for curiosity's sake, but it fit into themes they were exploring, like the disruption of the natural order or the presence of the uncanny. Check out our nursery rhyme podcast to learn more about that.
And this kind of does dovetail into modern scholarly interpretations, which we'll get into in just a minute. Before that, let's finish up the speculative theories. We've covered aliens and fairies. Any other wild theories worth mentioning? Well, I've even heard of interdimensional travelers, essentially the same as the parallel world idea.
Well, the only one that I can think of right now is the Babes in the Woods variant that Dr. Deneen mentioned earlier. That's more a localized legend. The idea that the green children were actually poisoned aristocratic children. The story goes that an evil uncle tried to usurp their inheritance by poisoning them with arsenic. Arsenic can cause a greenish screen tint. The children were abandoned in a forest, Wayland Wood or Fenford Forest. Local lore says that after escaping, they ended up falling into the wolf pits of Wool Pit. They survived just long enough to be discovered and were green from arsenic. This version was known to some 19th century locals. A folklorist and singer, Bob Roberts, in 1978, wrote that some in Woolpit even claimed descent from the Green Children. But that's likely a case of later folks grafting one legend onto another. It's a captivating story on its own, but it does not align well with the original medieval accounts, which never even mentioned an uncle or aristocracy or poisoning explicitly.
You're right, Chandler. The Babes in the Wood is a known English folk tale, usually with a tragic ending, and it seems that some in Woolpit they merged it with the Green Children's Tale at some point, as folklore tends to do. It's fun to mention, but it's not really a serious explanation so much as a local folk tale variation.
So, stepping back, we have rational explanations like lost immigrants, illness, and we have the fantastical like fairy world, aliens, allegory. No single explanation has been universally accepted, which is why the story endures as a mystery. Now, let's talk about how this tale has evolved over time, how it was transmitted, retold, and used in literature and media. It's one thing for two monks to write it down in Latin. It's another for us to still be talking about it now. What happened to the story after the 12th century? Well, Dr. Deneen, did the story disappear for a while, or was it continuously told?
Well, Dr. Weaver, after the original chronicles, the Green Children's story faded somewhat until the early modern period. William of Newburgh's Latin history was published in 1587, and William Camden, a great historian of the 16th century, called it a doubtful fable in 1586. Yet, by 1621, Robert Burton included it in his masterwork, The Anatomy of Melancholy, suggesting they fell from the sky, and scholars were intrigued. In 1610, a Latin edition printed both William and Ralph versions side by side. Then in 1638, Francis Goodwin incorporated the story into one of the earliest examples of science fiction. A moon dweller recalls a tale reminiscent of the Woolpit children.
So, how did it even become seen as folklore?
Well, the Victorians helped in that. In 1850, folklorist Thomas Kitely translated Ralph's version into the fairy mythology, reframing it as a fairy tale. That's when the story entered public imagination as folklore, and modern authors picked it up.
Poet Herbert Reed even called it the norm of fantasy and based his 1935 novel The Green Child on it. Others, like Randolph Snow and J.H. Prynne, also drew inspiration from the story. In the 1960s, John Macklin retold a fake version of it set in Spain. No such village existed over there, but it influenced the 10,000 Maniacs song and even a children's opera.
That's quite a journey there.
and and it continues. Academics have analyzed it from many angles: folklore, literature, even ancient aliens. Wool Pit itself embraces the legend. The village sign features the green children today, and the local museum proudly tells the tale.
I can certainly see why. Modern interpretations vary. As we say, folklorist John Clark believes the children existed, but that no theory fully explains them. Maybe, as scientist Richard Feynman said, it's more interesting to live not knowing. Some scholars, like Jeffrey Cohen, suggest the tale represents cultural or racial outsiders in post Norman England, with the children symbolizing the other. Catherine Clark links the story's placement in Williams' Chronicles of the Chaos of Civil War, suggesting it reflects societal trauma. And Ralph's version emphasizes Christianizing outsiders, perhaps a lesson on hospitality and integration.
I guess it's also relevant today. Think of how we treat strangers. Initial fear, followed by kindness. If the children were Flemish war refugees, the story becomes one of survival, adaptation, and compassion. It's kind of timeless.
And the mystery of the whole thing just adds to its power. Was it real? A folk tale? A mix of both?
As a historian, I favor the Flemish orphan theory. Chlorosis explains the green tint, and St. Martin's Land may reference the nearby village. But the tale likely evolved with time, adding some fantastical elements.
I like the idea of myth growing from truth. Real children, strange circumstances, and a story that snowballed.
Yeah, I'm mostly in the historical camp too, but I leave some room for weirdness because we all always get blindsided by truth sometimes. Sometimes the unknown keeps a story alive. The green children invite empathy and wonder. That's why I think it endures. We may never solve the mystery. Probably not, actually. But exploring it connects us to medieval history, folklore, and our own imagination.
For me, that's what makes it exciting, whether they were real or a myth. The Green Children teach us about how stories evolve and what they reflect about the society they're told in.
And they remind us that even the strangest tales can hold meaning. If not, in fact, then, in the discussions they spark.
Yeah, look, thank you for joining us. And until next time, hey, stay curious. Also, give us a like and come back soon.